Hello everybody, this is Matt from SmartBear, and today we will be talking about Zephyr Scale for Jira Cloud. Zephyr Scale is a plugin that sits directly inside of your Atlassian ecosystem. You can purchase it directly from the Atlassian Marketplace too. The Atlassian Marketplace will show you overall reviews, installations, privacy and security, as well as pricing directly from that Marketplace listing. If we jump back to our Zephyr Scale and Jira Cloud instance, we'll be greeted by the Zephyr Scale application directly here on the left-hand side. Once we click on this Zephyr Scale application, it will bring us to the main page of Zephyr Scale within this Cloud Jira environment. Something to note, Zephyr Scale is installed on a project-by-project basis. So if I change out of my apps project to, say, the demo project, the test case repository that we'll see is completely separate. Now, we do have the ability to reuse these test cases at the test step level and at the test case level too, which is something we'll definitely be doing here today. Let me jump back to my apps project and we'll go back to the Zephyr Scale repository. The first page that you see is that test case repository. The test case repository can be organized in a couple of different ways. Generally, we use folders. There are folders and subfolders, and there's really no limits to the amount of subfolders that you can have. You can have as many as subfolders as you want. We're going to quickly create a test case here inside of Zephyr Scale. We'll also look at previously executed one too. When we do create a test case, we're going to be first prompted with our name. So we'll just call this manual test case 7. If there's any objectives, preconditions, any of those text entry fields that are like the objective or precondition, we can insert images, we can insert links, tables, bullets, anything alike. Then we get into more of the details of the test case itself. What's the status of the test case? We have customizable statuses as well as priorities. I'll touch on those in a little bit. Any components that you want to link to as well, these are Jira components. Estimated runtime, we didn't add it to a folder. We could add it to a folder afterwards if we wanted. And if we wanted to add any labels, we'll just add a manual label really quickly. We have the ability to create more test cases off of this interface, but we're going to jump right to editing this test case now. So here's another view of that test case. You can see the number of fields that are available are a little bit different in this point of view. Everything that you see right now is a default field. We do have custom fields inside of Zephyr Scale. So let me quickly save this and I'll show the different configuration of custom fields. Custom fields are on a project-by-project basis as well. So if I click the configuration, it brings us to the area where we have access to all of our custom fields, all of our custom statuses, and really any of our tags too. We'll start with custom fields here at the bottom. So notice that there are different scopes of custom fields. We have custom fields of test execution, test step, test cycle, test plan, and test case. These custom fields are awesome. So we could do a number of different things. We could do, user select. We want a certain user to be associated to the test case or something like that. We could also do date pick. We could also do just like text entry fields. What I also like to show is the multi-line text entry field. So like, for example, operating system to test. And we can also do required custom fields, which is something that I really like too. So we can just force all of our users, whether they're developers, manual, QA, to follow the same standard in practice. But essentially, we can quickly go and add options to this custom field like OS X, Windows, Linux, and that's good for now. We can see these custom fields interjected at whatever scope we chose via the More Information tab. All default fields will be above the More Information tab. All custom fields will be below the More Information tab. Since we did not select this as a required field, there's no asterisk. As you can see on the name field, there's a red asterisk, but we can select our options nonetheless. We'll quickly click Save here, and we'll jump to the next step, which will be dictating our test script. Our test script can be written in a couple of different ways. Plain text is like one long text field. Gherkin is the given, when, then syntax, but 95+% of our users really like the step-by-step interface too. You can still write your content in Gherkin, but what you have the ability is to separate your step, your data, and your result level. Also notice since these are text entry fields, I can add images too. I expect, this is what the page looks like once it gets to a certain stage, anything like that. You can add images, which I think is really helpful as part of this process. But here we go. We can start, building out our manual test case, so given the browser is open and I navigate to the store, if there's any data or expected result, right? The expected result is we are navigated to the store correctly. Now we start building our test cases with, multiple test steps, when the user fills in a contact us form with data, the expected data, right? Name equals Matt, complaint, right? Equals I'm mad, something like that. And if there's any expected data as well. Here's where we really start to build our, full end-to-end workflows a little bit more. And here's where we also can start reusing granular pieces too. So with this call to test action item, I'm allowed to reuse any test case inside of Zephyr Scale. I'm not limited to a single Jira project too. I can change Jira projects, go to a different Jira project, and reuse a test case from that Jira project at the test step level. Notice when I import that test case in, it will include the associated test steps like we'd expect it to, but also it's referencing the test case. So it's coming from the demo project, test case 9 and version 3. Versions are really cool with Zephyr Scale. I'll give you a quick understanding right now. Essentially, if you wanted to make a change to a test case, but you didn't want to affect downstream test cases because we are using this component style structure, you can create a new version of that test case. We always maintain all previous versions, so if you do need to make some modification, you can, but it's really just to avoid downstream issues when you are making modifications. We also have data injection too. So instead of just interjecting data like I showed earlier, we do have test data parameters, which would be like a single value, username equals Matt, name equals John, a single value. We also have test data sets, which I prefer a little bit better. Test data sets essentially are let me go and create one for you, are an iteration of data. So those are also stored in our configuration section here. So the test data sets are essentially creating lists or iterations of data. So like, for example, instead of just doing like a single parameter, we're going to do multiple parameters, and then it will be like a data-driven test. So I added 3 instances, right? 3 iterations here. You could add as many iterations as you want. And then in our test case, if we want to interject that, we can do that simply by calling on the test data value of cities, and we can start adding columns. These are the iterations now, right? How many iterations do I want? We'll do 3 iterations, and I'll show what this looks like when we execute the test too. Now, where do we want to interject the data? It could be at the step level, it could be at the data level, and it could be at the result level too. And you can do that using curly brackets. One thing I do want to highlight is the ability that Zephyr Scale has now to run automated test cases. I'm going to quickly change test cases to a more defined test case, a more defined script. So notice we still have a pretty similar test case. It's a little bit longer, right? It's just running through a input values to our Bear store, which is essentially like our SmartBear e-commerce application. Now, what we can do is instead of running this test case manual, Zephyr Scale introduced a feature that will essentially take this manual test case and run an automated test based off of all of these manual actions.
That feature is called no-code automation.
Utilizing the AI-driven component, it doesn't like use some like Selenium or automation under the hood. It's using AI, analyzing each step, if there's data associated to it, if there's expected results associated to it to validate, and creating a virtual machine, provisioning that machine, and executing an automated test based off of that. Not only will it do that, but it will also recommend changes to make our test cases better.
That feature is called test step suggestions.
So on my first test case inside of Zephyr Scale, you can see that the first step is to search for a ball. We'll notice that that's not really the best test step, right? So the AI has decided we should update your test case to input the value of ball into the search bar and then click search as two different steps instead of one less detailed focus step. Now, when I click approve and run, this only happens the first time that you run the test case. It will then initial that virtual machine and execute that automated test case. It's performing each individual action based off of AI. It's not using Selenium under the hood, which makes it very, very robust if there is changes to your web application. And our test case doesn't need to reference those, IDs that are going to change or something like that. So the ability to take these test cases, provision them into automated test cases, and now we have an automated test case, right? All of our manual test cases are now automated test cases, so we can then go and perform our actions like necessary. You'll also get this great video, which I think is very helpful as part of that. Um, Also note, we didn't modify this test case, right? We modified that in our AI tool with the automation. Well, you can see the test script was modified, so refresh it to see the latest changes. The changes within the test script that we made are always going to be pushed back to Zephyr Scale too. So our test management tool has that central source of truth within the system. We haven't actually executed a test case yet. When we execute this run automated build, it's more of a check to make sure our automation is going to work correctly. We'll definitely execute a test case here in a minute. Traceability is essentially how we link our requirements to our test cases in Zephyr Scale. We can do that directly on the test case item. You can also search, across Jira projects for these as well. But generally, that's not how I like to work within Jira. Generally, I prefer to work off of my active sprint boards. These sprint boards will tell me what I have to do today, the stories I have to work on, my tasks, the overall defects that I have to work on, anything like that, right? On these story items themselves, you'll be able to see if there's any Zephyr Scale association to it. You'll also be able to see if there is no Zephyr Scale association to it. And what we'll be able to do is we'll then be able to create a test case directly on that story item or add an association to an existing test case. But when we do create a test case, that issue is linked automatically. So I prefer to work off of my sprint boards, tells me what I have to do. But two, I really like this feature because that, coverage will happen automatically. There is attachments, comments, and history that are available too. We'll talk about history, which essentially is versioning. So we'll jump to my end-to-end test case here, the one that we were talking about earlier with the really long script. For example, maybe I need to change this test case. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to create a new version. I want to create a new version because I don't want to affect other, components, other test cases that are using this test cases. So we're just avoiding downstream issues here. We'll create a new version. Note, we always maintain our previous version. So if we do need to use it, if we do need to modify it, we can. And let's make a change here. We'll add a step. That's additional step. We'll save that. So all of that will be maintained in the history. But what's really cool is one, you can compare versions, and two, you can report on these versions. Version 1 passed versus version 2 failed. Oh, the data injection is different. I find that very, very helpful to understand when we do get to the testing process of actually executing. Let's look at a previously executed test case here too. Let me, oh, I don't have one. That's fine. We'll execute a test case now. So when we execute a test case inside of Zephyr Scale, that will be done through a test cycle. A test cycle is like a sprint inside of Zephyr Scale. If we execute any test cases, it's done through a test cycle, ad hoc or planned. You can organize your test cycles in folders. I just mentioned ad hoc, so I'll do ad hoc during a smoke. Again, same limit. There's no limit to the amount of folders that you have. You can have your unlimited amount of folders to help organize these test cases and subfolders as well. Let's build a sprint. We'll call this a manual sprint. Again, there are default and customizable field options. I don't have any customizable field options in the test cycles, but they are available. Also note that if you wanted to reference, any release versions, iterations, anything like that, those are all referencing like the release versions, a Jira release version. The iteration is one of those custom configurations I showed earlier too. When we add test cases to a sprint, these test cases are being utilized at like the test case level, right? Not like the test step level. So we'll add in a test case. We are able to add in the same test case multiple times. We'll just have to disable that first option. We are also able to add in the same test case that is different versions if you wanted to as well. Use case if you wanted to like test across different environments or something like that, that's very common. And we are able to also work across Jira projects, right? Really, really easily. So we see that I added 4 test cases to this sprint. I'm just going to assign them quickly to myself. If I did want to assign them an environment or an iteration, I can. I don't have any iterations in this instance, but that's fine. I can also change these at an individual level, so they don't have to be all the same. For example, if I need to modify this at some point because like I'm sick or something and we need to reassign it to a different tester, totally okay. There's also traceability, attachments, comments, and history available on the test cycle level. We already touched on that though, so let's go to the test player and execute these test cases at a manual level. Notice that we are by default grouped into a couple of options. So you can see that there's different ways we can group our test cases. Generally, I like to either group by environment, so I don't have to change between environments a lot, that context switching, or I like to execute via priority. I also always like to enable this show only assigned to me option so I don't accidentally execute somebody's test case that is not assigned to me. Notice you also have the run automated test capability here, just like we had it at the test case level. The biggest difference here is when we click the run automated test now, the results would get updated back to Zephyr scale. When you do click run automated test, it does allow us to run tests in parallel and allow us to execute different test cases and configurations too. There are different operating or browsers we can run against too, as well in terms of the like building our manual test cases to automation. In terms of like a manual assessment, we are able to mark either test steps, pass, fail, or some custom status, or we can mark the entire test case as a whole. When you do start there's a timer capability too. I like to point this out so you can manage your estimated versus actual time spent testing. When you do change that to start, notice it changes to in progress. You can always overwrite this at the end though. All right, and we also can mark test steps as pass versus fail. Once you mark a test step as pass, it will change to in progress. Once you have a non-passing value like blocked, it'll change to the first non-passing value. And there are also custom statuses too for test cases, test steps, test executions, as well as test cycles. As you can see, these are the available ones that I have. We also can set all below to an executed value. So if I want to set them all to blocked, not executed, failed, anything alike, I can do that. And it just saves us a lot of time for clicking through everything, right? Just note that it's still your first non-passing value is the reason, or is the status for failure. We are able to also add issues, whether they are at existing issues or create a new issue. We'll create a defect here. You can create any type of issue type that you have available in your instance though. We'll create it. It'll automatically get added to the to-do boards, and if it's finished, it'll say like done, for example. We are also able to add attachments at the test step level, at the execution level, and I also mentioned at the cycle level earlier too. Let's change to test plans. Test plans are a higher level than test cycle. A test plan is more for reporting purposes, and it's really helpful for reporting like across Jira projects too. So for example, if I wanted to report on all of my smoke features that are across Jira projects, I will essentially go to traceability, add my existing test cycles in from a Jira project. Now, oops, click the close button. When I do work across Jira projects, there's really no execution here. I'm not going to be executing anything via the test plan. It's more for reporting purposes. If I wanted to group multiple cycles into a test plan, if I wanted to report across cycles that are in different projects, it just makes it a little bit easier to have that higher level. We also note people taking a test plan and tying it to a Jira epic, so you just have that higher level of traceability and reporting inside of Jira. In terms of reporting inside of Zephyr Scale, reporting is amazing. You have 31 different report options that are pretty much split between traceability and execution. Uh, we're going to start with the coverage report. These reports do work across Jira projects very, very easily. We're just going to keep it scoped down to a single Jira project when we're looking at our coverage report. A coverage report will essentially show us our coverage of a specific Jira issue to test cases. I like to look at stories in my use case. So stories are my requirements, though you can create a filter for whatever you want. You could look at, your story to test case coverage. You could look at your bug to test case coverage, your epic to test case, anything like that, right? What you'll be able to see here, though, is we have a lot of stories, right? We have 15 stories. We only have 2 test cases associated to these stories. So in order to get full-scale coverage for a project, for a feature, right, we need to take these stories and create test cases for them. And you can do that directly on that Jira issue item by creating that test case or an association really quick and easily, right? I actually prefer a different report than that coverage report, though. So there is a traceability report, which will tell us the same story. It'll be our requirement to test case coverage, but this goes a little bit more detailed. Well, it will show us the also execution result and if there's any like defects associated to that too. In terms of the execution reports, there's a lot of great execution reports. You can have execution reports that go down into individual, step result failure, or you can keep it super, super high level too. So here's like a high level summary report. You can see like this is just the highest level that you get. You get your overall progress, your executions, any effort if you've described it, issues reported, and now it's more like execution coverage, breaking it down based off of environment. All of those reports are also available on an individual level too. So if I wanted to get like more detailed onto some of those execution reports, I can. If I want to stay more detailed into just results, I can do that as well here too. We can also filter by any field inside of Zephyr Scale or any status inside of Zephyr Scale, which is my favorite feature. We can filter by custom fields, we can filter by default fields, anything alike, right? Which priorities are the highest, which operating systems are, OS X. I'm pretty sure we're going to have none here because I just added a test to a test case, right? But we can filter by extremely granular nodes, default fields, custom fields, statuses included, which makes it really quick and easy for us to slice and dice these reports, right? Is it an automated test type? Yes, no, anything like that makes it quick and easy for us to slice and dice these reports. There are also dashboard widgets available too. The dashboards are, let me just go. There are 21 different dashboard widgets available too. They're essentially like the same that are available on the reports. There's just a couple that are missing. The biggest difference here is these are auto updating dashboards. So it can, filter by any of those custom fields we mentioned earlier, but the biggest difference is it's an auto update every 15 minutes. So these dashboards are great for having, a centralized location for personal people, like a personal dashboard, a team dashboard, private, public dashboards. What do I have to do today? Where am I? What's the status of everything? And then the reports I see are more like I'm looking for a specific information type of data. But these are great dashboards. There's over 21 different widgets, like I mentioned, and we're continually adding them as well. In terms of automation with Zephyr Scale, I did show Zephyr Scale with some AI today. That's if you didn't have an existing automation capability, right? We're taking our manual test cases and we're automating them. But what if we already have existing automation for some of our manual test cases? How can we integrate that? You can integrate that with Zephyr Scale very easily. So Zephyr Scale does have a public REST API with 0 API limits. If you did want to integrate with any CI/CD system, any automation tool, the big requirement when it comes to Zephyr Scale is that we accept the report in JUnit XML. So there is great API documentation that we have, but essentially you can publish a report to Zephyr Scale using JUnit XML. You also have the ability to post a custom report format. I just find that most automation tools already will output JUnit XML, so it's easier. And essentially what this will do is we'll take our report, parse it for specific information, and then publish that to a test cycle. So let me show you that next. So here you can see the automated build coming from a CI/CD platform. Specifically, this is an API test. It's a suite of API tests. What you'll be able to see here is Zephyr Scale took that JUnit XML. Within that JUnit XML, there was 16 different test cases in there. Based off of the test case name or the test case key, Zephyr Scale will update a previously executed test case. So you'll be able to see, we can see the reason for failure, 415 status code. What's the next test case reason for failure? 405 status code. Swire compliance failure, 200. So it actually will parse the reason for failure in the report and add that to the comment of the actual execution. What you'll be able to see on the test case itself, if we go to execution, is the previous execution history for that test case. So every time when we update either via the test case key or the test case name via that automation tool, it will update with a new execution that contains the information in an associated cycle. You'll be able to see if it's an automated build or if it's a manual build and who executed it and a bunch of the other execution information too on that test case. If we were to click that execution, it brings us back to exactly what we saw before. One last thing I wanted to touch on was some of the project settings inside of Zephyr Scale. Zephyr Scale does have a number of project settings that I think are very useful. The most important that I get asked about is permissions. Zephyr Scale does have permission-based access systems that do follow the Jira-based permission groups. So you'll be able to say specific users can't delete test cases, roles, or groups of users as well. Maybe specific groups of users can't change that configuration with the custom fields, custom statuses, anything like that.